This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute. Every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. And we are making a special appeal. If you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Thanks a lot. I mean, for real. We also want to introduce a cool new feature. Our guests and topics often spark interesting discussions online. Those discussions are scattered around Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes direct emails. Now we're creating a special post for each episode where you can ask follow-up questions or discuss the topics with other listeners. We will link to the post directly in each episode's show notes. All you have to do is find where your podcast app puts the show notes, click on the link, and you'll get directly to the post. Then Gilad and I will review the comments and address the most interesting ones in the next episode. You don't have to be a supporter of the show to join the discussion, although of course we encourage that, but just go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review.
Today we're happy to welcome Eitan Regev. He's an economist and research fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute. He earned his PhD in economics and his master's degree in economics from the Hebrew University, where he's now a lecturer in macroeconomics. He worked as an economist in several government offices, including the Ministry of Health's Budget Division. His main fields of expertise are the Israeli labor market, labor productivity, and the economy of the ultra-Orthodox sector. Together with colleague Yarden Kedar and Naor Porat, they have written the Handbook on Vocational Training, published earlier this year. Dr. Eitan Regev, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, glad to be here.
So can you explain the distinction between vocational and academic training in the Israeli context specifically, and how does that interplay between them affect the economy at large?
Well, there's a very significant distinction. Basically, academic studies longer and require much more initial skills and capabilities. You need to earn your matriculation diploma, take a psychometric exam. They are designed for, I would say, higher capabilities portion of the population. And the types of professions that they train for are more white-collar professions. You might say that the vocational training system is much more targeted and specific. The training is shorter. The entry requirements are lower. And more labor market targeted professions, which are aimed at giving the students specific skills that will enable them to integrate within the specific industries, whether it's the manufacturing industries or food industry or hotel industry. The system is training them specifically to those professions, whereas the academic system trains people how to think, gives them much broader spectrum of opportunities.
I mean, the interesting thing is we always assume, it seems to me in the modern world, that the greatest goal for every young person is to get an academic education and to be, have higher education, BAs, MAs. Professional training seems like a sort of a dry field in a way, but your paper points out why it's really so critical for the economy and social development. So which is more important? Which is more important for the future of any modern economy?
So this is an excellent question because, it's always good to have your academics in your economy, and Israel has one of the highest share of people with academic degree as a share of the population.
What is that share of the population?
In the young ages, it nears 40%. So we are second only to Canada in that respect. But the question is, do you really need all those academics and what professions? And can you really forgo all those less regarded professions that are really still essential to the economy? Can you only rely on a trade and service economy? Can you really forgo your industry and manufacturing industries? And the answer is no. The answer is you only need so many lawyers, you only need so many accountants, you only need so many psychologists.
And certainly not very many political scientists. I mean,
economists.
Just completely superfluous.
Or economists.
Economists, accountants.
No, we definitely need you, so keep explaining to us.
So what we really need to check, and what the OECD is already checking, and where the real problem of low productivity of Israel lies, is the mismatch between the needs of the economy and the composition of skills and composition of professions that are being trained. We have put too much emphasis on academic training, and we basically dried up the vocational training system budget-wise and image-wise. And as a result, our manufacturing industries, which are an essential engine for growth and for increasing productivity, are suffering from lack of qualified manpower. They have insufficient and inappropriate training. And as a result, labor productivity in our manufacturing industries is low compared to other OECD countries. And also the share of people employed there relative to the level of productivity in the country is extremely low. In other words, our manufacturing industries are shrinking at a faster pace than they're supposed to.
I have a chicken and egg question here.
Exactly.
Isn't that decline in vocational training a reaction to the shrinking of the manufacturing industries in Israel and not vice versa? I mean, from what you say, I understand that because there's less manpower, there's less manufacturing. But isn't that the other way around? Or at least this is the way I believe to perceive it.
So excellent question, because as countries develop, as their economies progress, you do see a trend of a rise in the share of trade and services and a decline in the share of manufacturing. Having said that, there is still a phenomenon called premature deindustrialization, which is the rapid decline of the manufacturing industries before your trade and services industries have put in place the mechanisms and the infrastructure for high productivity activity. Meaning, basically, our trade and services industries are mainly focused in the local market. We do not export finance activities. We do not export communication activities. And what the manufacturing industries do is, if you have a successful manufacturing industry, then you export those goods and you increase the overall GDP. Productivity is GDP divided by the number of hours worked. If you have triple the number of lawyers or accountants or economists or whatnot, then they increase the denominator, but they do not increase the numerator.
But let's talk about the changes in the Israeli economy in particular, this shift to what you call trade and service industry. I mean, as far as I know, a big chunk of the Israeli economy, I've read up to 1/3, is driven by the high-tech industry. Is that included in trade? And if so, isn't that the direction we should all be going in? Or, in terms of training future employees? Or, as you point out in your report, is there a limit to how much the high-tech industry can actually employ the rest of the workforce?
Or in other words, what's the potential cost of focusing so much of our attention in terms of policy, etc., on the high-tech industry?
So the high-tech industry only employs between 8, it's debatable how you count it, how you measure it, but only employs between 8 and 10% of the entire workforce in Israel. And those 8 to 10% are people with very high skills. In other words...
Which actually sounds quite a lot.
Yes.
Although it sounds like not that much when you consider what a big portion of the economy it is. If it's true that it's up to 1/3 of the economy is being generated by high-tech, you can tell me if that's correct.
It's not 1/3 of the economy, but it's a very large share of our exports.
Okay, of exports.
They do contribute a lot to our economy. It's one of the main engines and drivers of growth in Israel.
But it's concentrated in only 8 to 10% of the employees.
And the growth of that sector is very limited due to the fact that basically, practically almost everyone who can work there actually works there. And, well, while we can still integrate some populations like women and the Arab sectors and maybe part of the ultra-Orthodox sector there, it's almost reaching the limit of its potential growth-wise. And we need to ask ourselves what would be the other drivers of growth of our economy. And when we direct the rest or the vast majority of the rest of our labor force into other academic fields that are, some of them are flooded. If you look at the legal industry, if you look at the financial industries in some markets, then we have much more people trained than we actually need. And in other professions, we have a severe shortage, especially in some manufacturing industries. That mismatch is correlated, very highly correlated, with low productivity. What we show in our research is that countries that have high mismatch between what people study and what they actually do once they go to the labor market. So that mismatch is very highly correlated with low productivity, meaning where people don't work at the fields that they studied, the productivity is much lower. In Israel, because we don't have enough vocational education training, because the vocational education and training is not suitable enough to the needs of employers, because it has a very low negative image nowadays, and because wages are low, it is a chicken and egg case, Less people go there, the training becomes less relevant to the needs. And as a result, more and more people go to academic studies, even though you only need so many lawyers.
But it's also a question of investment of resources, as you show in your research. I mean, there was a sharp decline in the programs and money that the state invests in vocational training in the beginning of the 21st century under a certain finance minister whose name shall not be mentioned. No, actually, it should be mentioned. That was Benjamin Netanyahu.
But at the same time, during that phase, we saw a rise in employment and people
exactly my
in the
question.
workforce. How did that happen?
Since you claim that vocational training is so necessary for growth, for high productivity, then at the same time, even after that decline, this sharp drop in investment in vocational training, we have seen economic indices continuing to grow. So unemployment, for example.
Specifically people joining the workforce from 2003. So what's the correlation?
Yeah, we're talking about
them?
15 years on. Still, we were still in this upward trend. How do you explain it?
So it's a very important point to make that our problem is not employment. It's labor productivity. The Israeli economy is basically in full employment. We have 3.9% unemployment, which is basically what we call friction unemployment, people between jobs, meaning everyone who's interested in working actually finds employment. So the problem is not finding a job. The problem is how much is that job contributing to the country's GDP, and how much does it increase labor productivity. Now, if I have double or triple the number, for example, of lawyers in the country, when the sum needed, then they would all share the same cake. It might be a large legal cake, but they do not increase GDP, hence they do not increase productivity, as opposed to, for example, another factory that exports and brings money from outside and increases GDP. So that is the first point to make. The other point to make is that the reason we are seeing the decline in vocational education and training, and the reason that we're seeing the cut in budgets, is because the state has decided to change the purpose of vocational education and training. The purpose used to be to train the necessary workforce for the needs of the economy. Today, it's to provide answers and employment to the lower echelons of the population.
Which is part of getting them to join the workforce, is that right?
Yes. And the problem with that is that the purpose of the vocational education and training system should actually still be training the necessary labor force for the needs of employers and the economy. Now, what are we doing wrong that other countries are doing right? That is the main question. So what we are not doing and other countries are doing is on-the-job training and increased involvement of the business sector, of employers. To put things more accurately, the business sector is involved in vocational education and training in Israel, but it's not the employers, it's not the factory owners. It's private contractors, business schools, private business schools, etc., that are acting as subcontractors for the Ministry of Labor, but nobody's really regulating what they are teaching, what's the composition of professions. Are these professions that they are teaching really what the economy needs? Do we really need another 3,000 kindergarten teachers, or do we need CNC programmers? Do we need machine operators? So what other countries like Switzerland, like Germany, like Denmark, like England are doing is that the employers, the factory owners, and other employers are much more involved in the training process. Much of the training process has on-the-job training, which is virtually non-existent in Israel. And this creates the link, the connection between the curriculum and the skills that the trainees acquires and the needs of the employers.
So you're saying it's not one against the other. It's not that you either invest in the low-skilled workers who are not part of the economy and you train them to join the economy at all costs, or you meet the needs of the economy. You're saying a country can do both.
Yes, a country can do both. And our main problem is the insufficient involvement of employers in the training process. It solves several problems if they get more involved. It solves the problem of relevance of the curriculum, the pedagogic curriculum, because if the employers are part of the mechanism that shapes and update the curriculum, they can make sure that the curriculum is most up-to-date and in tune to the skills that they need from their employees. They also solve the problem of funding, because when you see apprenticeships in other countries, in Germany, in Switzerland, in England, then those apprentices are being paid for the work that they are doing. The employers might lose some money at the first year, they're balanced the second year, and then the third and fourth year, they're already making money. So this solves a major problem, because many of these people who go to vocational training have very low incomes, and they cannot afford to forego income for the duration of the training. So in Israel, there's a major problem why many people are simply not coming to vocational training.
I want to ask about this. It's not in your report, but I can't help but think of the fact that Israel seems to have had a rash of very severe accidents in the construction industry, for example. And there's a lot of criticism, things like cranes falling and killing people. There's a lot of criticism that people aren't trained properly. Is this like one of the results of this failure that you're talking about to actually do on-the-job training? Is this actually hurting also the quality of those services? And I think of like Germany, where they have beautiful construction, just enviable levels of construction. Is that one of the effects?
Definitely. There's definitely a link. And let me give you a simple example. Let's think of a simple class in mechanics in high school or in technological college, where they teach people how to fix cars. Now, what they would teach them, or they used to teach them in high schools today in the vocational education, was the knowledge that you needed 30 years ago. How to fix a car, how to open the engine, how to,
Even I can know.
how to check the oil, twist some screws and bolts. But today, what you really need to fix cars is knowledge in computers. Today, everything is being computerized. Today, you need English. And the problem was so severe that it pushed the car importers to join hands and form the solution. They formed a consortium called the Momentum Initiative, and they created mechanics classes in high schools. They created mechanics majors in the technological colleges, and they incorporated it with on-the-job training. And they made sure that they are now provided with the necessary labor force that has the sufficient knowledge. If the employers, if the business sector is not involved in the training process, then the curriculum is not updated. The skills that the trainees acquire are not necessarily relevant to what they would actually need to do later. They have less experience, and all of this leads to a lower quality of skills and a lower relevance of skills, and this obviously can lead to more accidents also.
I'd like to take it back to the policy level, perhaps the macro level, in a comparative perspective, as you spent some time on in the report. and ask you, to what extent in Israel, the fact that there are two sectors of society, mainly, who have been traditionally and chronically underrepresented in the labor force, that being the Arab Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox, to what extent is it a benefit or a disadvantage? On the one hand, I mean, there are people who are venturing into the labor market for the first time, so they are perhaps trained or less trained or not at all trained, but definitely in another way than other people. So it could be either a benefit because you can shape them the way you want, or a disadvantage because they really lack even the more basic skills than what vocational training would require.
So it's a disadvantage and an opportunity because, yeah, it's true that it would be preferable if especially ultra-Orthodox boys would have better, initial skills, would have study any core curriculum at high school level. And the lack of that makes integrating in the labor force very difficult for them. And we are seeing in those ultra-Orthodox that are trying to integrate into academic studies, we are seeing very high dropout rates. We are also seeing a very high opposition to them entering the academic fields from their leaderships. So that is the problem, but that's also the opportunity.
And there's less opposition of them entering vocational fields?
Yes, definitely.
That's interesting.
So,
why is that?
Because the vocational education and training being shorter, being more specifically directed at a specific profession, are less feared to have the potential of making the ultra-Orthodox boys and girls less ultra-Orthodox.
It doesn't nurture critical thinking, perhaps. That's really the...
Well, this leads to a very philosophical question, but finish your answer. I'm going to ask my philosophical question.
It's shorter, it's more to the point, it's more directed specifically at a specific job, and it's also a matter of image. Academic studies are associated for the Haredi leadership with taking their flock astray, basically, and nurturing new ideas that might make them question their faith and become less Haredi in the future.
Well, I mean, I think this really ties into an underlying problem with this whole question, which is some of the social norms that have changed over time that have influenced government policy. And one of those social norms was in the early years of state, as you pointed out, heavy investment in vocational training, but then criticism of that because it seemed to deepen social gaps in society. That changed, but then the policies changed. And then we have also, well, I don't want to pile on, but my second question is really, don't we need academic studies in order to nurture critical thinking with or without vocational training? I mean, unrelated. Isn't it a good thing that people learn, these critical thinking and, broad liberal arts education? Or are you saying that doesn't have any value? No, that's kind of a pile on.
It doesn't
That's
really
a
care
pile
about
on,
that.
but I think they come from the same place. In other words, what are our norms and understandings of the meaning of education in society?
Well, of course, we need critical thinking, and of course, the academic system is essential, and it trains the vast majority of our labor force nowadays. Having said that, we cannot afford to forego our vocational education system, and we cannot afford to forego our manufacturing industries. And some people are more suitable to the academic track, and other people are more suitable to the professional and vocational track. But countries that forego their industries too early would suffer from lower productivity, and everyone would feel it in their pockets, would drive down lower wages. Now, what you are tapping into is also a question of image, of public perception. And vocational education training has suffered in recent years from very low public image. And it's really a chicken and egg case because, low investment and lack of involvement of employers and lack of relevance of the curriculum leads to lower productivity, leads to lower wages, leads to a lower image, leads to a lower investment of employers and factory owners in infrastructure, in technology, which leads to even lower productivity, which leads to even a lower image and less people coming to vocational training, and the continuing shrinking of our manufacturing industries and a reduction in overall productivity in the country. So we really need to, find the mechanism to make employers more involved in the entire process of training, introduce on-the-job training, make the employers more involved in shaping and updating the curriculum, and also make the state more involved and make the state understand that we cannot afford to forego our vocational education training system, meaning the state needs to put much more money than it's putting into that system now, and monitor its activity better by collecting data, making sure that the fields being studied and that the curriculum being studied is relevant to what the economy needs, and that the graduates actually go on to work in the professions that they're supposed to and that they're being trained to, and that those private contractors that are training them now are not simply making a buck over the state and over those trainees.
But the low image problem doesn't apply, as I understand it, to the ultra-Orthodox, because it's not like whether the young ultra-Orthodox students can choose between vocational training or academic training. For them, it's vocational training or bust. So maybe, I'm asking you, from a policy point of view, maybe instead of directing young, relatively accomplished potential students from the academic track to the vocational track, maybe the ultra-Orthodox can somehow fill that void.
So as someone who's researched the attempts of the ultra-Orthodox community to integrate into academic studies, and having seen the difficulties and the high dropout rates and what it means to try to earn an academic degree without having attended high school, then definitely for a large portion, especially of Haredi boys who are trying to integrate into academic studies, I think vocational education and training would be the better
Is it
alternative.
happening?
It's happening to some extent, but the ultra-Orthodox sector alone cannot provide the entire answer for the shortages in the vocational education system. They cannot account for the entire shortage of skilled labor force. The integration of the Arab sector in vocational education and training might be another pillar in the solution. But we also need the rest of the population to regard it as less demeaning and more honorable profession as it used to be.
Is there a normative change among policymakers? Is it going in this direction? Do you see the first signs?
Well, maybe before we answer that, can we go back historically and find out why there was such criticism? Why was this streaming, people into either academics or vocational considered bad socially? Like the idea that it deepens economic and social gaps between different populations. Can you explain how that?
Yeah.
Because I think that feeds into the bad norms.
Absolutely.
Well, it was accused, the vocational education system was accused as perpetuating the gap between center and periphery, between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, and simply because in certain parts of the country, in certain sectors of the population, the opportunity to go to receive proper high school education and to go on to academic studies, which has the higher potential of earning, was virtually non-existent. Basically, some portions of the populations were not given any other alternative. And this meant that they were basically doomed to go to vocational education and training. And this was obviously accused as perpetuating the gaps. So we're definitely not saying that specific sectors should be limited to vocational education and training. This would be harmful, and this would mean very low social mobility. But definitely people who are suffering from lower initial skills because they did not attend a high school, because they did not acquire certain core materia, the vocational education system might be a better choice for them. But we should definitely not limit people to or try to decide for people what's best for them.
Sounds like you're saying everybody should start with equal opportunity and then
Yes.
have the chance to decide which direction they take.
So is it going in this direction among policymakers today?
Yes, I think it's finally sinking in that the Israeli manufacturing industries have shrunk too rapidly. and this is harming the economy. It took me a long time to convince the people, Ministry of Finance and other relevant ministries that we have a mismatch problem. We have a mismatch of people studying one thing and then going to work in another thing, and that is harmful. If you only look at how much people earn, then you might say, let's send everyone to academic studies. But you have to understand those people are sharing the same size cake. They're not making the cake any larger. And they're saying that vocational education and training have low yields because, productivity is low and wages are low. But how can you make them higher if you don't invest in infrastructure, if you don't improve the curriculum, if you don't make employers more involved, and if you don't monitor it? So it's really a catch-22.
Where was the resistance coming from inside the political and, on the ministerial level? Who was opposed to what you're saying? It sounds so logical to me.
No, because I'd like to pile in on that and ask, to what extent is really this rapid deindustrialization linked to the advent of neoliberal policies that are in many ways linked to Netanyahu's economic policies?
Excellent question. So the answer to both your question is, and the perception within government, speaking about Ministry of Finance, but we can speak about other ministries that had the same perception, and I always had to answer to that question when I said that there is a mismatch, that, those neoliberal concepts always tend to believe that the market would always solve itself. So that means that it cannot be that people go and study fields that are not necessary in the labor market. They would always assume that the market would arrange itself. Meaning, if people go and study a certain field, that must mean that it's needed. In practice, there is an information problem. A young soldier finishing the army does not know what expects him at the end of the road after finishing his academic track or his vocational education track. He does not know what his odds are of finding a job, what would be the wages. And that information is not at the moment being collected. And
neither did a certain undergrad studying comparative religion back in the early 90s know those things, not mentioning any names.
Exactly. So one of the moves that we are pushing now, and together with the Ministry of Labor, is a database that would publish those data, make them accessible to everyone, about vocational training, also about academic studies at the level of the specific college or university. If you studied, say, law in a specific university, what would be your expected wages? What are your chances of graduating? What are the dropout rates? What are the entry criteria? What is the return to your investment? And how many jobs are actually needed in the economy for that profession? So solving that problem of information would make a better fit. That is one aspect of it. The other aspect, like I said, is once you involve employers, by the way, not only in vocational training, also in academic studies, what you see in America and in Europe in almost every field is internships. I studied for 1 year in Brussels, in an American college, and you used to make internships, private companies, and that would be the first step in the labor market. That makes you more in tune to the needs of the labor market. Once we solve the information gap, the information problem, and convey the needs of employers to the training system, whether academic or vocational, by making the employers themselves more involved, then we solve the problem of the mismatch. And once you solve the problem of the mismatch, you solve the problem of productivity. You also solve the problem of funding, because the funding would come from the employers themselves, and you make the studies more relevant and productivity higher.
We are looking at each other because we have to end, but I always have one last question, and it's a summary question. Is Israel's economy threatened and facing a crisis because of low productivity unless this changes?
So it's a complex question because
God's going to kill me.
No, it's a complex question because when we look forward, we have exerted the rise in growth that can be attributed to a rise in employment. Basically, we already put much of the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs into the labor market. We already increased the share of the population with an academic degree. So where would the rise in productivity come now? I think definitely the place to look for is the manufacturing industries and vocational education and training. So if we do not solve that problem, we are definitely limited in the growth that we might see in future years. And we are also at the risk of not tapping into the full potential of low-income, low-skill populations like the ultra-Orthodox men, Arab women, etc. So without tapping into the potential of the vocational education and training system and the manufacturing industries, we definitely might expect to see lower productivity in future years.
All right, Dr. Eitan Regev, a fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shalem, our producers, as well as the Israel Democracy Institute for their generous support. Most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you a very special request to consider writing us a review. All you have to do is go to the ratings and review section and actually write a review, hopefully a good one. You also can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. You can also follow Dalia and me on Twitter. And of course, do not forget to join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.